Frank Smyth, thank you so much for being here, making the trip down here to have this discussion on human security. So just want to start off with, if as concisely as you can. I know we're going to keep it short for your introduction, but just talk through your experiences in your career and kind of what led you to your current capacity.
I started off in grad school and got a grant to look at trade unions in El Salvador. And in the course of that investigation, I obtained confidential and secret documents from the U.S. Embassy showing that the Reagan administration was bribing union federations to leave an anti-government federation and join a pro-government one by offering them promises of monthly support through the American Institute for Free Labor Development, which was an AFL-CIO entity. And that got me set as on the road to journalism, because before that I was thinking I would want it to be an academic. But one of the things I realized is that it's hard to analyze what's going on if you don't know what's going on. And in a place like El Salvador, there were so many questions unanswered that the line of inquiry became more investigative than trying to figure out, what to call it, right? So I worked in El Salvador for a number of years and did well, and also managed to write a report with a human rights organization and a co-author, which advocated cutting off military aid 50% after a guerrilla offensive and the murder of the Jesuits, which was a big human rights abuse. That ultimately was accepted by Congress, and it actually brought the military to the table. So I went to Iraq in '91 and took the same idea of embedding with guerrillas and applied that to the Kurds in the north. But the Kurds got clobbered, and myself and another guy were captured after another journalist was captured with a guerrilla, and they were both executed, right? So I then worked in Guatemala for a number of years and was looking at human rights abuses by the Guatemalan military, but then it came to my attention that military officers were driving peasant farmers off their plots of land to build clandestine runways to run drugs. And they had a petition, and they delivered this to the DEA. The DEA had more cases than they could handle, and ultimately, one case, the first extradition of a military officer, went all the way up to the Constitutional Court, and they approved his extradition. And then 11 days later, the Constitutional Court president was assassinated, and then the new court denied it, and the Clinton administration covered up that was the first ruling that had approved the extradition. They covered that up for 4 years, which I eventually, myself and La Nacion, broke in Costa Rica. I then ended up working for Human Rights Watch and going to Rwanda to investigate who was arming the government and guerrillas of Rwanda. The government was committing a great many abuses, and the report came out 3 months before the genocide, which was good timing, at least to get the information out there. And then I worked for Human Rights Watch again, looking at military matters in Colombia. And in particular, there were two questions that we were asking, but because it's an organization, as you can imagine, there was a little bit of infighting going on. One question was, is the military working with illegal paramilitary groups to run death squads? In which case we found evidence to say yes, and also found evidence that a commission of U.S. military advisors, including DOD and the CIA, and we got this confirmed through Senator Leahy's office and a letter that he solicited from about this commission, that they had encouraged this Colombian military to make all their intelligence networks covert and compartmentalized, so they could run these things without leaving a paper trail, right? Which was complicity in murders. And then I also, the other question that we had asked was, is aid, that all the aid in Latin America by then had been earmarked for the war on drugs, but it was being diverted to the counterinsurgency where abuses were occurring. So I managed to obtain documents that showed an Amnesty International report. Southcom did an internal official use but not classified audit, thinking then somebody like me couldn't get it through the FOIA, but I got it anyway, which showed that 12 out of 13 units cited by Amnesty International for having committed abuses in Colombia had received either U.S. training or U.S. aid, right? And that became the Leahy Law, right? I then worked in Sudan for Human Rights Watch, but the project itself, I was no longer the lead, right? The fact that I gave some documents to Amnesty International didn't go over very well, though I think it was the right thing to do. But what I ended up doing is learning about bin Laden and interviewed a defector from the Sudanese intelligence services who I interviewed, and during the first of the interview, I finally said to him, this is in translation, right? My Arabic is just, I can just be polite. But I said, wait a minute, you like him, you respect him. And he said, yes, right? And he was then had joined a group of defectors who were not pro-bin Laden. They were being backed by Horn of Africa states and the United States on some level. And he said, yeah, well, he said in Arabic, he does what he says he's going to do. In other words, he's not a hypocrite, which I found that to be fascinating. And that opened the door. Peter Bergen and I did a piece, ended up filing pieces to the New Republic at the same time, right after the East Africa bombings, which we both concluded was Al-Qaeda and was bin Laden. I had some leftist friends. One in particular, I remember, said to me, how do you know he did it? Like thinking I'm making an Islamophobic sort of presumption. And I said, look, I've been working in the Horn of Africa for 2 years. I know and writing for Jane's and working for Human Rights Watch. I know every insurgent group and irregular group on the ground in the region. Nobody has the motivation, the wherewithal, or the organization to be able to hit 2 U.S. embassies at the same time in 2 different states. And of course, we were proved right on that. I then worked for the Committee to Protect Journalists for 11 years, right? Which was a transition for me. And interesting because I was the Washington rep, so I would deal with members of Congress, right? Testified in Congress, did a lot of press, and also went to embassies like the Sri Lankans who were where journalists were being beaten, killed, or disappeared, or jailed, and lobbying them for better treatment. At the same time, sort of not necessarily lobbying for anything particular from Congress, but making sure Congress understood the importance of press freedom. And then I actually worked with Adam Schiff, because he founded in 2006 the Congressional Caucus for Freedom of the Press. With the co-founder was Mike Pence. And so I worked closely with his office, worked closely with Schiff, and Schiff in particular. And I spoke at the inaugural event before Schiff in 2006, I think that was. And then I also was by then the journalist security coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I was revamping their security program after the abduction and beheading and murder of Daniel Pearl. And that led me to look at issues of training, and I was on the board of a group in London, and the International News Safety Institute, which has changed a bit, but it was a good group, certainly at the time. They got money from a Danish group to train journalists in local countries, which I fully supported, but the training was giving them sort of traditional hostile environments training for war zones, and I pointed out, at that point, 3 out of 4 journalists being killed around the world are being murdered. 2 shots at the back of the head. They're not stepping on landmines. They're not dying in airstrikes. They're not dying in crossfire. They're being murdered. So shouldn't we have training that would address the more subtle challenges of being followed and being targeted, as opposed to just, tactical threats, which I'm not belittling tactical threats, but they're separate. And people thought, oh, come on, it's just, what are you talking about? So I decided to set up my own organization to make it better training. And I hire a lot of military people and sometimes intelligence people, self-defense people, people with counseling backgrounds, right? Sexual assault counseling, sexual assault avoidance, digital safety, to try to sort of modernize and have a more holistic is such an overused term, but a more integrated approach to training. So I think that's where I'm at, and I write on the NRA, and I still write on human rights issues.
Thank you for that. And it sounds like you have a lot of experience to back up your discussion here today on human security. So maybe you can start with kind of describing human security and talking us through your experience with that subject.
Well, that's a tricky concept, right? It's kind of, it sounds very concrete, but when you get into it, it's very nebulous, right? I think that, and if you go back to Sam Huntington, right, Political Order in Changing Societies, what people are looking for, and we see that now in the United States, what they're looking for is for government to provide an environment which allows them to thrive, right, where they will be safe, right, physically, where they can find places to work to support their family, where they will not be repressed if they want to bargain for higher wages or form a collective bargaining arrangement and perhaps even a union, where if a drug trafficker who's working with the military, right, a local military officer, decides that somebody's daughter is going to be his girlfriend, that a community, a family would not have to succumb to that kind of coercion and that kind of sexual assault, and would be able to, where the state would be able to provide some level of order and justice. Right. And I think as others have said, right, when justice is denied and when expectations are also denied, that's when you get increasing social problems.
Right. Yeah. So maybe you can talk through some of the differences, and I know that you've outlined how the perspective between the citizens and the state. Maybe you can talk us through some geographical differences based on your experiences in the different regions that you talked about from your career.
Yeah, one of the things that's fascinated me, and I haven't pursued it academically or journalistically yet, but it's been on my mind now for decades, is that governments, militaries, counterinsurgent campaigns have choices in how they're going to pursue their war. You can pursue a war where you are attempting, because it's always a challenge, to respect human rights, to respect the rules of law, to genuinely avoid and minimize civilian casualties as you are going after legitimate military objectives. At the same time, insurgents have choices, but in an asymmetrical warfare, when the insurgents have less firepower, no air power, right, there's often a tendency to resort to indiscriminate bombing of targeting of civilians, right? What we've seen in very, very different nations around the world, right? But I think what strategic thinkers in the military need to be aware of, the choices you make and how you wage a war will determine how that war ends and the society that comes out afterward. If you commit acts of, like for instance, in El Salvador, in the beginning of the war, if the army thought that there was a guerrilla among young men, there's a guerrilla living on a street, they take 10 young men who are all between the ages of 17 and 22 years old and execute all of them in order to kill one guerrilla, right? Well, so they didn't care about the collateral damage. Whereas in a place like Guatemala, it was, and this is a time where, in the beginning of the war, as the war continued in El Salvador, the military aid coming to the Salvadoran military was being approved by Congress and coming in at the rate of $1 million a day in military aid, right? So $360 million a year, which was a great deal in the 1980s for a country of 5 million people. That meant that also, and some Salvadoran commanders complained to me about this on the record, that the CIA is telling them not to target people, not to go out there and kill and target, they wouldn't say kill, but target people en masse. What the Americans at that point, including the CIA, were pushing the Salvadoran military to do is, look, Congress is watching. So we need you to be more selective in who you're targeting for repression. In other words, target the people who are actually involved in military operations on the part of the guerrillas, and not just the people who may live in communities and support them, or the university Jesuits who are sympathetic to some of their goals, but are in no way involved in their activities or subordinate to their structure. And that worked up until the offensive of 1989, when the Army was left by surprise. I wrote a piece in the Village Voice called Caught with Their Pants Down, and because they missed the intelligence. And the first thing the Army did, or within days, was, okay, now we're going to kill the university Jesuits, right? Which was a mistake, and that actually backfired on them and led to aid being cut off and them being forced to negotiate. But because the war human rights had been imposed from outside on the military as a condition of the aid, it made it easier to pursue a negotiated settlement, which in El Salvador was somewhat organic. It was real. There's a gang problem that emerged from that afterward, but then it was a genuine negotiated settlement. It was not a negotiated surrender, because the guerrillas by the end of the war were as strong as the army. Now, you go north, right across the border into Guatemala, an entirely different situation. The military aid coming to Guatemala is coming through the CIA, so nobody knows about it. We know about Tim Weiner in the New York Times has reported the amounts of aid, right, which were substantial, just as substantial as for Salvador, but it was all covert aid, right, through the CIA. The Guatemalan military had no interest in winning hearts and minds, at least in any conventional sense. What they were interested in is a slogan that they came up with, which a sergeant who was involved in operations told me: "Here, the innocent pay for the sins of the guilty." What does that mean? That means going to a village in the highlands, and I've interviewed people in these villages about 10 years after these massacres occurred, and there's still a tremendous memory about this. And there were two people recently that one village they had found walking around and perhaps bringing food to the guerrillas. And the people turned against those two individuals because that could bring heat from the army. And what some of the people in the villages said, burn them alive. Where does that come from? Because in the early 80s, as now has been documented by a Jesuit, Ricardo Fayo, in his book that came out in 1994, excuse me. He, in Guatemala, if they knew the guerrillas were operating out of a village, where they would come in and they would have relations with the population, they would get food and supplies, and they go up into the mountains, but they had a rear guard that they could go to in the village. If the army knew that the guerrillas were operating in the village, they would say, okay, the innocent are going to pay for the sins of the guilty, and they would take the 5 or 8 grandmothers, the oldest women of the village, put them in front of the village, right, and make everybody watch, put gasoline on them and burn them alive in front of the entire village, right? And this is not, this is incredible things, but going way beyond the level of oppression in Salvador, which you would think is impossible, right? But they did. That approach leaves a legacy of terror in the society, which makes it very difficult for any sort of reconciliation. It really does so much damage, even more so than Salvador, that the level of oppression I was talking about before, that really causes permanent damage to the fabric of society, and it makes it impossible to have any kind of negotiated settlement where it's going to lead toward establishment of a functioning democracy or the application and the practice of following democratic norms, right? In Guatemala, it was a negotiated surrender. The guerrillas still existed, but they were really defeated. And I pushed some of them on it to get them to admit that, right? You barely exist, right? And that it wasn't trying to humiliate them, but I just wanted them to. I wanted an acknowledgement. You're not a military force of any consequence anymore. Yeah. The fact that you can still have squads on 2 or 3 volcanoes, that's not. That doesn't give you a punch. They had some moral authority, which is why, and the government was pressured and had its own reasons for wanting to reach a settlement. But a negotiated settlement in Guatemala was very different than what happened in Salvador. And what I would say now too, if you take this lesson, and then I'm going to stop because you can, right? If you take this lesson and you look at current conflicts, including or past conflicts, right? In the IRA, the Irish Republican Army against the British military in Northern Ireland, both sides were concerned about their image, right? Even though the IRA committed war crimes, or would be considered war crimes, or were war crimes of bombing pubs with civilians in them, right? And the military also committed abuses, right? And some of which were brought to light, both false imprisonment, but also targeting people outside of the bounds of either British law or the rules of law for an international, or for the Geneva Protocols, Protocol 2, right? These things all occurred, yet both sides were concerned enough about their image, right? Their public image, that they have some respect for human rights, that they were able to reach the Good Friday Agreement, right? Which worked and ended this war. And in the end, Martin McGuinness, right, a butcher, but who was the top IRA military commander, Queen Elizabeth shook his hand as part of the acknowledgement of the Good Friday Agreement after it was signed, or when it was signed. And that, to me, was an extraordinary thing. I have friends in the British military who are still upset about that, right? I respect their views, right? I get that. But when you have that, when you have parties, as vicious as the fighting may be, that are still concerned, there's still some semblance or some desire to respect humanitarian law on both sides, it's easier to get to a settlement which can be lasting, which I think the Good Friday Agreement has been lasting. Not perfect, but lasting. Now, if you go to Israel and Hamas now, Hamas's actions on October 7th were blatant, there's no ranking in human rights crimes, but those were egregious violations of international law, right? Egregious violations of any standards or norms, right? Raping, killing, right? And some of the rapes were exaggerated, or may have been exaggerated, I understand that, but there were rapes that were occurred, there were murders that were occurred, and the seizing of hostages. These are all violations of international law. Israel has responded in a manner of the rules of engagement that, as I see them, and I'm interpreting them, right? I don't have necessarily privy to anything, but it seems that Israel has taken the view, if we think an area could be used by Hamas, is either being used by Hamas now or could be used by Hamas in the future, we have a right to bomb it no matter who's inside, including a bunch of civilians, a bunch of children. Right? And that's why two Human Rights Watch directors, Aryeh Nair and Ken Roth, have each written separate pieces in the New York Review of Books, right, why these are war crimes. And that's consistent with South Africa's bringing of charges of acts of genocide against Israel in the International Criminal Court. But I think that conflict has gone on for so long, and possibilities for reconciliation have been undermined, where it seems like there's an element of Israeli society that has been vocal about wanting to drive the Palestinians out. At the same time, there's an element on the Palestinian society that from Hamas and directly using that line of from the river to the sea, that can be interpreted in different ways. But Hamas has used it in a way, we want Israel completely destroyed. Right. When that happens, it means you're going to a negotiated settlement becomes almost impossible.
Yeah. No, Natalie, you had something you wanted to bring up about earlier.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff. It's just in terms of how we're talking about human security and how people are used for political ends in ways that could constitute, in many ways that you're talking about, war crimes, right? And different examples of this. I mean, some of the most, I think, salient things that you said with that were the burning of grandmothers, right? And just how horrific acts are used for political ends. And I think that tests the boundaries of what we mean by human security and why it's something that's important to consider in terms of actual people who otherwise aren't involved becoming used for whatever you would describe that as. Like, what is the purpose of doing something like burning grandmas as a spectacle, in a way? What is that?
It is a spectacle.
It is a spectacle.
Well,
right.
it leaves a legacy of terror.
Right.
And on that point, I'd like you to go back to your two case studies on Guatemala and El Salvador, and really just to kind of back us up before the wars started in both cases, to kind of maybe talk us through some of the things that led up to the conflict in both those states.
I can. in Salvador, it's quite interesting because there's coffee, cotton, and sugar were the three export crops of El Salvador right before the war began, and at a certain point, mechanization, right? Tractors, John Deere type stuff, whether it was made by them or not, it might not have been new, could have been brought down, but a number of large agricultural producers, whether coffee, cotton, or sugar, in El Salvador started mechanizing. So next thing you know, a lot of farm workers, right? Because that's what they are, really. They're landless peasants, right? So they're farm workers, wage laborers, and seasonal wage laborers. All of a sudden, there's more of them unemployed and seasonally unemployed than ever before. At the same time, you've had Christian Democrats in power and some level of increased pluralism that has raised expectations. So the combination of raising expectations combined with technologically driven roots of increased unemployment, right? And I'm not saying that detractors are bad, but this is just what happened. That led to a situation where the rising expectations combined with the deteriorating economic conditions was a recipe, as Theda Scotchpole and others have laid out for an insurrectional movement, right? And I think one of the things that I noticed in El Salvador reporting is I would talk to people about who owned the land and what was going on. And in places where the army was active, where I would go out with the army, right, in these areas, and I saw the armies were running their own patrols, I was wondering, how can the army have so much control here where they don't seem to have any control in different parts of the country? And that's because this was an area when I was in that area, that had undergone some level of land reform. So you had people with their own plots of land, and it was actually working, right? So the American approach and this, the military approach was very much American, what the Americans also were pushing, but it was working because the land tenure patterns gave people an investment in their land, and they needed the army to protect them. Whereas on the slopes of the San Salvador volcano, where I went with the guerrillas, I met coffee pickers. And they said, well, and what the guerrillas did on the volcanoes is they went to the growers and said, you're gonna double your wages, or we're gonna burn your coffee harvest. And so the growers did. They paid more. And then I remember interviewing a coffee picker, and she said to me, she goes, well, what do you think about what the guerrillas are doing? Well, we eat more now. Right, and I'm writing about that as the crumbs are falling from her mouth. I mean, it was quite literal and quite visceral, right? So the land tenure patterns are something always to think about, right? And levels of inequality. Right. And usually it's land, but increasingly in modern society, it may be less land, maybe other reasons for it. But looking at, Latin America has got the greatest level of inequality historically, and I think still among any continent. It's also the most violent continent, even more violent than the United States, right? With arms flowing from the United States, but that's another matter. But looking at inequality, looking at land tenure, I think has a great bearing on how conflicts, or whether a conflict will develop.
Right.
So do you think inequality is sort of a condition for something like that to happen, to grow? And then at what point does it become okay to use actual people as props for that, to justify or enact conflict in that way, if that makes sense?
What do you mean use them as props?
In the grandma example.
Oh, yeah. Because if in other words, we're not going to address the inequality.
Right.
We're going to give you a stick, right? If you're going to, if you want to push back and fight for higher wages, you want to threaten to burn our crops, we'll come after you.
And it escalates and escalates and escalates until it becomes that barbaric spectacle.
Right, the spiral of violence that we see, we've seen in Northern Ireland, we've seen in the Middle East and different places, That's what you want to get away from if you want to have any solution. But that requires, people like Nelson Mandela are rare,
Sure.
people that have the vision who can still represent a resistance, but still have a vision. And the same thing on the military side. And you see there's people in the Israeli Defense Forces who have always had a vision and understood that the annexation of territory is going to create problems for us in the long run. But those voices are they're still there, but they're less heard.
Right, and it's getting at how do these examples of extreme ways in which human security is compromised, right?
Yeah.
What are how does that end up happening? Because in general, most of the time people are adverse to committing those violent type acts in general, right?
Yeah.
So how is it that it gets to that point?
Well, it's usually been that way a while. In
Right.
Salvador, you had the Matanza in 1932, I believe, right? A large massacre of farmers, which actually was so total in its effect on society that Salvadorans were wearing indigenous traje, like in Guatemala, and after that, nobody wore them anymore because people were targeted just for wearing indigenous traje. That shows you that level of fear. Mm-hmm. And in Guatemala, an entire class of coffee growers came over from Germany, mostly from Germany, in the late 1800s, and set up this system of banana and other cultivation where the needs of the population were always relegated to a secondary, tertiary concern, right? And after a while, this creates its own problems, right? There's a reason why what do developed nations have? They have less inequality than less developed nations. They have more consistent application of the rule of law, which I think is absolutely essential. And there's less corruption, right? I used to go to a place in the beach, just in the middle of nowhere, right, or just a residential area, and there was this guy in his car with his buddies. And he was like driving like 17-year-olds do, like an asshole. And he went to peel out, and instead of peeling out, he was in reverse, and he backed into a concrete wall and crushed and killed a little girl who was selling fruit. And I remember I came out and, hey, what happened? And And the guy was sort of telling his friends, it's okay, because they were having a big party, like no big deal. And then I went back and I, asked around. He paid money to the family, and that's it, right? Because she was poor and he was rich. Now, if the girl had been rich and the guy who was driving had been poor, they would have killed him right on the spot and nothing would have happened. Because that's when I learned the roots, what I had been missing. I understood what Salvador was all about, but that really drove it home. And in a lot of societies, you have to remember this is the backdrop, right? And there are a lot of people then have an interest in, there are smart people with money. In Salvador, before the end of the war,
dumb people with money.
No, I know, but I interviewed, and my co-author at the time, a number of people who were oligarchs, as we would call them, very wealthy guys, and one of them had been kidnapped by the guerrillas, right, and held for ransom. And he said, "Look, our project is to develop this country economically. We can't do that unless we end this war. We want to end the war. And this guy, I'm friends with Alfredo, the president. He wants to end the war." And that's when the lights went off. I went, wow. So the oligarchs want to end the war. The government wants to end the war. Christiani government wants to end the war, which is the Arena Party. The guerrillas want to end the war because I already covered that. And they were already preparing their people to end the war, which is a political, ideological shift. The army's out because they're getting $1 million a day and they're stealing about a third of it based on reporting by Joel Millman in the New York Times. So we said, okay, let's propose cutting off military aid by 50%. And I can't believe it worked, right? So that was, it's rare that those things come together. If you look at Israel and the Palestinians now, there's not that basis for common ground, right? Or constituencies.
But, I want to get at what it is we're really talking about here. And I think, the corruption and disregard for human life exist on a spectrum, and we could say that a similar thing happens here, just in a different way, right? So certainly, if you took that story about the little girl being hit by the rich guy, we could apply that situation to something that might happen here too, right? So it's not to say that we don't lack corruption. It just looks different based on where you're at and the level of perhaps resources that your country has. I don't know. I'm trying to.
Yeah, but the level, the level of corruption
Sure.
in the United States
Sure.
or anywhere in Western Europe or Japan or Canada, and the level of corruption you get in less developed nations is incomparable.
Right. And it's not to say that those nations are inherently corrupt, right, because of some quality of them in and of itself. But it could be that what would explain that level of corruption is a sort of just systemic lack of resources, dehumanization that happens because of a variety of different means, but it's not something about that culture in general. It's something about the conditions, right?
And also the history of their own indigenous culture, the colonization period, right? It's and levels of education, right? In this country, for the most part, if you there are ways to get, if you can get educated, which is usually within reach to some degree, you can improve your standard of living for not all people, but for a lot of people. It's been more within reach than in other nations, right? In less of in Central America, if you're born poor, the only way you're gonna have any social mobility is to leave, right? For the most part, unless you're very lucky,
If I could add on to your point earlier about the differences in thinking about the corruption or the developing nations, thinking about how strategists may try to wrap their head around the process of engaging with other nations, other militaries, other diplomats, other representatives, in terms of creating some sort of strategic alliance for maybe some more either mill-to-mill or other types of unilateral efforts in that region. How should folks who need to do these types of outreach think about engaging? I mean, you talk about the legacies of terror. You talk about the differences in understanding with respect to corruption, in terms of education, all these different, I could say culturally at this point, of course, but how should a strategist think about, that process of engaging?
I think
specifically thinking about the U.S. In
I think
those
military to
nations.
military ties can be very effective. They have their limits, but U.S. training is often the way for a local officer in a nation outside the United States. It really helps their resume. It really helps boost them. However, we also have so many what was formerly the School of the Americas graduates who have been implicated in tremendous abuses, or the Atlacat Battalion in El Salvador that was an elite force trained by the United States that then ended up being involved in a number of different massacres, right, over time. So I think there's we have to make sure that we're not talking out of both sides of our mouths. For instance, in Colombia, there was the Mill Group in Colombia was huge, right? And I was inside those facilities, and I was impressed just by how many people were involved, right? And how large it was. But the Mill Group in Colombia was having these ties and teaching professionalization skills at the same time that the military and the CIA were encouraging the military, reorganize your intelligence networks to make them covert and compartmentalized, because then you can commit abuse, use them to commit abuses, and you have plausible deniability. That's not helping, right? It does. There's a military objective that's being achieved, but it's coming at the expense of your integrity, of your honor, of the rule of law. Maybe honor's too much of a word, but it's not helping. And it's not helping create democratic norms. It's not moving us toward a democratic solution, or a solution that is consistent with democracy. So I think those ties are important, but I think we have to be able to have an honest discussion. And one of the most interesting cases was in 1989, after the offensive that I mentioned by the guerrillas. 3.5 days into it, the Army had a meeting of the High Command. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is kill the Jesuits, because they had been the biggest critics of the Army. Shoot them in their pajamas on the lawn, try to blame it on the guerrillas. That all backfired. But during the investigation, when and there's a lot that could be said about this, Messon and William Walker, who I know quite well, was trying to find out what had happened, and asking military advisors, if you know anything, come to us. And then out of nowhere, Eric Buckland showed up, right, major at the time, I think, and said, I have information. I know something happened. And an officer, a guy named Aviles, who I knew some people in his family, actually, had told him that, I just want you to know, my superiors killed the Jesuits, but I had nothing to do with it, right? Buckland sort of hemmed and hawed, and he wasn't really rewarded for coming forward either. It kind of destroyed his career, right? And Aviles, he held on, but he also destroyed his career. So we have to sort of, if we're going to do this and we want to really advance our objectives, which are peace and stability, and I think the promotion of democracy, right? You've got to have the discussions. Well, what do we, how do you wage the war? Let's have that discussion. Let's not just talk about, okay, this is how you take a position. This is how you provide suppressive fire. This is how you flank the enemy, right? Things that I know a little bit about, but you guys, this is what you do. I appreciate all those skills, but you also have to talk about how is the war being waged, and really talk about, not just tell them, well, you shoot somebody after you capture them, that's a crime, right? But to tell them, get into the nitty-gritty to talk about how the military campaigns are being, because most of my experiences in Latin America, where the U.S. is the main outside sponsor, and where abuses have been committed, U.S.-backed abuses in almost every nation. And I don't think it's helped the interest of the United States. I don't think, Chomsky, who I also have a lot of, he's a very kind man, and a lot of respect for him, though I think he's wrong a lot too. But the view that everything is about economic interest is not true, right? There's a lot that's done because of ideology, and there's a lot that's done because there's just inertia. And I think what the strategic community needs to do is to ask the question, how do we want to wage war to get the outcome we want to have? And that's what I don't think is being asked.
Well, so at the War College, we do this very thing in terms of how we discuss what national interests are, and how, a decision to go to war, is that in the interest, and how does that relate to our national interests? And you talked about a lot of those interests that we tend to project into the world, like democratic ideals, rule of law, a free and open economy, essentially. One of the things that I was going to say in terms of answering your question, and I think it gets to what you're talking about too, is I'm always going to say this. I'm always going to go back to the idea of strategic empathy and understanding what it is, either your adversaries or allies, what it is they want and what their perspective is coming from, because it might be very different than ours. And they might have different, and probably do have, different national interests than we do. And so if we...
And different ways of looking at things.
Exactly, right? And so if we proceed treating strategy through the lens of ourselves, then that's how we can make a lot of mistakes that we see.
That's brilliant, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
thank you.
that's right.
And this is kind of like leads me to this question, which is What three things would you want our viewers and listeners to take away from everything you've talked about so far?
I think that we need to be mindful that what is happening between Hamas and Israel has potential to destabilize the region, if not the world. And I think we need to understand that the approach of, well, we're going to just, encourage Israel, but let them, it's gone too much. And I think finding a way to bring that, to turn down the heat in the Middle East is going to be essential. And I think that may mean conditioning at least military aid to Israel. But I think this is something that I'm concerned about, because the way this is going, it's only going to explode, right? At the same time, you have, I think the world is dividing at this particular time. And one path leads to states that are cooperating, like the European Union and the United States and others, to try to solve common problems, whether that's shipping lanes, whether that's preserving the polar bear, whether that's attempts to reduce global warming, right? But there are that notion that we have been building, that the United States has led the effort to build since 1945, right? Those institutions and those practices are challenged, but what's challenging them, the other path, if the cooperation is one path, the other path is warlord states that are not interested in human rights. Russia and China going to nations in West Africa is occurring now with Russia, or China going to nations where they have interests in the South China Sea and saying, we don't give a damn what you do to your own people. We're not playing that human rights game that the Westerners try to shove down your throats. We're here to give you the weapons and to trade with you and to help you as much as you can, and you'll help us by giving access to deep water ports and your natural resources, right? And the world's dividing into these two camps, right? And the Russians and the Chinese aren't necessarily allied either, right? They just have a similar outlook. And I think strategically, both the political community and the military community have to think about how can we. It's time to I think, find ways to integrate respect for human rights into military planning, so they're not so much antagonistic to each other or in friction with each other. And I think that's going to protect and advance U.S. interests in the best possible way in the long run. But I think that's a tall order, and I realize there's resistance to it now in the United States, because America First seems to be an American version of the warlord mentality. So I think this is, it's a discussion that needs to continue at the very least.
Okay.
Yeah, I just think that, and my interactions with members of the military community in terms of strategy, they do attend to issues of human rights, right? And the consideration of how this affects people, I think, especially those, I don't want to speak for the military community, but those who have been involved in conflict are wary of entering conflict again.
You're talking about U.S. troops getting involved. I'm more often the U.S. is providing the support and for local forces to do what they're going to do. Right. But they tend to, in Colombia, you could look at the map and say, okay, these are the villages. The paramilitaries we're going into one village after another, committing enough massacres of people they think are supporting the FARC to turn the community against supporting them. And then the military comes in afterward to maintain order. Everybody knew this was a coordinated plan. But the U.S. advisors in Mill Group weren't having the discussion with, hey, you guys those paramilitaries are committing abuses. Instead, they were the ones saying, keep it covert and compartmentalized, you won't have any problem. So there's been a bit of duplicity, right? And I'm not saying that to offend anyone.
No. I'm talking more on the strategic level, right? Not
of deployment of U.S. forces.
In thinking about involvement, however that is, directly, indirectly.
I understand.
And I think your point is integrating how what will happen will affect those who are in those communities, in those cities. Yeah. And in many cases, I think you described situations where you were reporting on human rights abuses, but in some cases it was ignored, or maybe as you just mentioned, there was awareness, but the actual strategic outcome was more valuable than the actual protection of human rights, and so it means, I think, from a larger conversation here, finding ways to integrate that upfront into thinking about the outcome, because at some point this will be a part of the dialogue. You can choose to ignore it, but at some point, whatever whenever the chips fall, there's going to be this legacy, this rememory in many cases of what exactly happened. And we want to make sure, at least from the U.S. perspective, we not only are able to protect vital interests, pursue natural interests, but also protect legitimacy.
And attend to the possible unintended consequences and of what might happen in your various different examples of how U.S. intervened in those areas.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been a
my
great
pleasure.
Discussion.